All right, I think we'll make a start. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. My name is Helena Hahn. I'm a policy analyst in the European Policy Center's Migration and Diversity Program, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's policy dialogue on EU and US perspectives on labor migration. I'd like to use this opportunity to thank our partners for this event, the US Mission to the European Union, for their excellent cooperation. In recent years, labor migration has increasingly moved into the purview of policymakers, both in the European Union and the United States. In some respects, this may be attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic, which revealed many realities as well as weaknesses in the way the respective labor markets are set up and function. And while post-pandemic effects certainly warrant continued attention, several dilemmas and challenges have emerged on top of that. On the one hand, unemployment rates are currently low, 6% in the EU and just under 4% in the US, according to recent estimates, but both are also facing acute skills shortages in key sectors. Demographic change has emerged as another major challenge, whereby the implications of aging populations for the sustainability of social welfare systems is a shared concern. Arguments in favor of labor migration have also been made based on the need to ensure global competitiveness while undertaking the twin green and digital transition. And while many an economic argument has been made for more labor migration, the challenge of attracting and retaining foreign workers also highlights the importance of effective social and inclusion policies. Finally, labor migration is one tool for migration management used both by the EU as well as the United States. And so greater access to labor migration pathways and economic opportunities is offered as an incentive to get countries of origin and transit to cooperate on limiting irregular migration and return and readmission. This is all to say that labor migration is as much of a domestic policy issue as it is a matter of migration cooperation. Today's event is an occasion to unpack some of the dilemmas and trade-offs policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic are faced with. The event also comes at the heels of the European Commission's launch of a new skills and mobility package just yesterday, aimed at addressing some of the very challenges mentioned just now. As such, the goal of today's discussion is also to consider possible responses and solutions, to weigh the advantages and disadvantages of different policy tools, and importantly, to identify any learnings and opportunities for greater exchange between the United States and the EU. With this said, I'm pleased to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers for today. We have with us online Damian Boeselager, who is a member of the European Parliament for the Greens EFA. Thank you very much for joining us. We also have Jonathan Chaloff, who is a senior expert in migration policy at the OECD. Then joining us from the United States, we have Julia Gelatt, who is Associate Director of the U.S. Immigration Policy Program at the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. And finally, Tara Watson, who is the Director of the Center for Economic Security and Opportunity at the Brookings Institution. And last but not least, with us here in person, I'm also pleased to welcome Teresa Hornung, who is the Deputy Director of European Affairs at the Confederation of German Employers Associations, who has kindly agreed to step in on behalf of Anne Franke, who was no longer able to join us today. Before I hand over to the speakers, a few brief words on housekeeping. I will be inviting the speakers to give their initial statements of around 6 to 7 minutes, after which there will be a short panel discussion, and the rest of the time will be dedicated to a Q&A, where I would invite all of you to raise any questions. For all those here in person, please raise your hand and activate the microphone in front of you before posing your question. For all online attendees, please submit your questions in writing by using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. I would also invite everyone to keep them as concise as possible and not to forget to please state your name and affiliation so we know who you are. A final note to say that this event is being recorded and that a recording of the event will be available on the EPC's website shortly thereafter. Now, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to the first speaker, Mr. Chaloff. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks for this invitation to this interesting discussion. So I want to do three things today. I just want to provide a very quick overview of the global trends in labor migration, with a focus on the USA and Europe, and then look at some of the commonalities and differences between the two contexts in terms of policy settings. and then look at what the EU has been proposing lately and how it's positioning itself in this competition for labor migrants before concluding. So just an opening point, as we published in the recent International Migration Outlook, where this 2022 was really a peak year for all different forms of migration. It was a record number of permanent type migrants at 6.1 million to the OECD, more than 2.5 million temporary foreign workers to the OECD. That's excluding those who would go to Poland, which we count separately. 2 million asylum applications. That's also a record. Almost 4 million fleeing Ukraine, not included in the asylum numbers, and almost 2 million international students. So record numbers in every category that we've been tracking from about 20 years. So if we just look at labor migration, the OECD separates this into two types: permanent type, which means people who can stay indefinitely, and temporary. And if we look at permanent type labor migration, it's also at a record high at 1.14 million. About 500,000 of that is in the EU. So the major countries are the UK at 170,000, USA, which is actually lower than the UK last year, Canada, close to the USA, and Germany at 90,000. And you can see year-on-year increases of over 100% in the UK and Ireland, and over 50% in a number of EU countries like Austria, Finland, and Germany. And if we look at temporary labor migration, also at a record high, so more than 600,000 seasonal workers, more than 400,000 working holiday makers, more than 200,000 trainees, and 1.1 million other temporary migrants, and that's also excluding Poland. And there you can see that the USA picks up more than 300,000 of these temporary labor migrants, and the other major countries are Australia, Canada, and Korea. If we look at the EU, most of the labor migrants are counted more in permanent type migration because they come in on a kind of residence permit that allows renewal indefinitely if they maintain the job and eventual permanent residence. So this is not, these are record numbers, but this is also an intended policy outcome. This is the result of some policy decisions, but it also doesn't mean that it's a permanent increase. So we can see that there's some ceilings being put on expansion in Canada and Australia. Certainly in the UK, they're reviewing some of the issues that contributed to this increase. And on the temporary side, we do see an increase in the program size and bigger objectives. So now coming to the differences between USA and Europe, which might be useful for this discussion. One of the major policy differences is that the USA restricts migration in categories where most European countries do not. So high-skilled migration, which is either uncapped or symbolically capped in Europe, has a cap in the USA for the EB and H-1B, for example. So the US could get more. The demand exceeds availability. There's a waiting list. There's a backlog. There's a lottery for attributing the H-1Bs. And in Europe, the ceiling is really the demand. Now, the demand might be discouraged by some long processing and some hassles in the permit system, but it's not a hard limit. So it seems to be more of a matching issue that employers aren't interested in recruiting from abroad because they can't find candidates or those candidates don't match. Second difference is that the USA doesn't really work on a bilateral agreement basis with other countries. So labor migration is done, let's say, unilaterally. There are some trade-related exceptions and some unilateral decisions about specific countries, but it's not a bilateral model. Third point is the USA has no attraction strategy. A number of individual European countries do have them, although they're a bit disjointed. And the US labor market is very open to migration. I don't think we can underestimate the role of English language use for attraction and also for integration. The last point on this difference is that Europe has more flexibility to introduce reform. So the US is stuck. It's not my job here today to say why, but the US doesn't have the same flexibility that individual countries in the EU have, for example, to run pilot programs and to do policy experimentation. And that allows some different practices to emerge, and it makes it safer for other countries within the EU, or even the EU at the EU level, to try new policies and to make major adjustments. So the last question is really that I wanted to cover this afternoon, is the positioning of the EU in tackling these labor needs, and whether the pathway that it's traced with the recent policy announcements is sufficient to meet the upcoming challenges. So as I said, last year, there were already about 500,000 permanent type labor migrants coming to Europe and millions on temporary work visas. So the system is running. There are people coming. Europe can get people. So the question is really, can it get and retain skills? There's a higher retention in the US than in Europe. So we need to understand where the EU can play a role. It can't offer visas. It can't offer permits. It can't offer a job search visa. So one thing it can do is matching, and that's where the talent pool that the OECD did a feasibility study on and was announced as a proposed regulation. It seems to be a pretty good idea. Employers, of course, are not big fans of intervention by the public employment services. So it's a question of what would help to accelerate the migration procedure. One point that we've raised in the past is that this kind of talent pool will take a few years to really get rolling. The proposal from the Commission is voluntary, but it's still necessary, along with outreach and some information campaigns. Second point on where the EU can intervene is on trades, training in origin, recruiting for apprenticeships. This is where the talent partnerships are useful. The language is a barrier, and that's something that has to be overcome through these kinds of partnerships. But even when there are participants, they still have struggled to get approval for the visas. So there's still a visa problem, a consular issue in origin countries. Quite often there are other requirements that make these pathways hard to use. And the last point is the recognition of foreign qualifications, which is clearly an important issue. So none of these specific points, a recognition of qualifications, and the talent pool for matching, and creating these channels for developing skills are game changers. They're not going to revolutionize this 500,000 labor migrants to Europe. And we would expect that the scale of would be small for the next few years, but these certainly seem to be the right directions. So just to conclude, I would say in the background of this comparison between the US and Europe, there is the fact that the US is closed opens a lot of opportunities for other destinations. If the US did decide to open and remove some of these ceilings, it would make much more difficult for many other OECD countries to compete for the same skills and talents. So I'd stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much for running us through what is quite a catalog already of policy tools, and I'm sure that we'll get to talking about some in greater detail later. But I'd like to now hand over to Mr. Boeselager, who has been a very active voice on labor migration issues within the EU. Very pleased that you're able to join us today. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. The reason why I sit in such a beautiful room here, you can actually see it there, is that I'm in a Spanish ministry where we have a conference currently running on labor migration. So you can see it's a conference within a conference that I'm now attending, if you like. And as I'm speaking, the Commissioner Johansson and Vice President Skinas are on the stage downstairs with representatives from different countries outside the European Union to discuss the role of talent partnerships and collaboration there. And this morning we discussed also about it. So, and that's why I might need to leave at some point, but I hope I can stay for the full length. Let's see. I mean, I think, Jonathan mentioned many of the important issues of how we compare with the US, but I think I would just like to make it very simple and then have more time maybe for the Q&A. The first fact is we need labor migration in the EU. Yeah? So there's a very simple fact, and you can look at a lot of numbers that tell you already where we have shortage of skills and labor, that can, even with the best reskilling systems, not be covered. And that, demographics don't lie. So either we somehow manage to build a functioning talent migration system, or we will have a big problem. And this is just a pure fact that I think we can start with. And again, if you want to have numbers on this, there's many out there. The second question then is, how do we actually get good at this? And one truth I think is that when we compare the EU to the US, we have to understand that we don't really have a functioning European immigration system in the sense that the US has. So the question is, how can we Europeanize the European system to be working? And this is basically what I've been trying to work on with my assistant Camilla, who's also sitting here next to me, since the beginning of the mandate. Jonathan, you said that English speaking is a big factor, and if the US would increase its limits, then we would not, as other OECD countries, be able to compete. I think that's definitely a factor, but I think also the simplicity and the size of the labor market is another big factor. So for third country nationals to move to the European Union, there is no such thing as freedom of movement, or at least it's limited and conditional. And so I think to really play into the strength, if you want, of the European labor market, you have to create one for third country nationals. And this is one avenue of what we have been trying, first for highly skilled migrant workers via the Blue Card Directive, where we at least gave them the right after 1 year to be mobile across the European Union. That's what I'm trying now in the law I'm negotiating, when the lead negotiator from Parliament is the Long-Term Residence Directive, where we also said, like, look, if you have been here at least for 3 or 5 years, and it's discussed how many, then you should have the portability of status. So you should be able to move from one member state to the next to be able to, take advantage of this one European labor market. And now with the talent pool, I mean, Jonathan, I think we sat together in 2019 when you told me about the talent pool. So this was at the beginning of my mandate, when I had absolutely zero idea what a parliamentarian does. But anyways, you were kind enough to talk to me. And since then, we have been bringing in the talent pool into every communication, every piece of paper that Parliament produces on labor migration. We made sure that the talent pool is in there, and proposed it also as a pilot project. And now, as you said yesterday, it has been proposed and is at least making a step into the direction of the US, in the sense that we want to allow an expression of interest-based model, basically, that from across the world you can say, I would love to work in Europe or the EU, and then you could be matched with European employers, and then maybe step by step we can also work our way towards skills recognition on a European level, towards qualification recognition. Maybe we can make our way towards more mobility and upskilling also remotely if needed, and we can make our way to a useful collaboration. I think what wouldn't be a successful route to take, which is being discussed downstairs right now, is to think that we should, when we're in such a deep competition situation for international talent, we shouldn't make migration conditional on whether you are taking back asylum seekers that got rejected. Like this whole idea of strategic migration management, of somehow helping countries more if they also work closer with the European Union on asylum issues. I think that's a direction that I'm trying to fight a bit. Okay, so this is just a rough overview of the topics that I work on that I'm already working on, and happy to go into the discussion.
Thank you very much. It's great to hear about some of the activities that you started working on since, of course, the your mandate is going to be over next year. And there's still quite a bit of work to do. Now, I'd like to hand over next to Ms. Gelatt to kind of make a start with sharing her views on the US perspective. Again, both the issues when it comes to migration management, but then maybe also more some of the domestic policy issues that I mentioned in the introduction. I'm sure the audience here is very curious to hear about. So please, over to you.
Thank you so much, and it's great to be with all of you today. So yeah, I think that all of the presentations so far have set this up well. I mean, the basic dynamic that we face on immigration in the United States is that our Congress has been unable to update our immigration laws for a long time. We're working with employment-based labor migration policies that date back to 1990, but that are really built on an infrastructure from 1952. Jonathan mentioned the greater possibility in European countries of trying out pilots and trying new policies. And as immigration policy analysts in the United States, we're very jealous and wish that we had that freedom here to update our laws more frequently on the basis of emerging labor market needs and demographic changes, and to try out new policy options. But we're really quite stuck. When Congress does talk about immigration, it's very focused on migrants arriving to our southwest border and the role of our asylum policies and attracting migrants to the border. On the left, there have been attempts to offer a legalization or a regularization program for the country's estimated 11.2 million unauthorized immigrants. And labor immigration is really just not on the agenda. So in the absence of policy reform, we've seen the executive branch through successive administrations make greater use of its authority on immigration. That authority is quite limited and also contested. There's a lot of litigation about this. But we have seen the Biden administration try to embrace what it can do to facilitate and expand labor migration. Some of that is intentionally focused on bringing in needed workers more quickly. And some of that is really quite focused on trying to address the issues at the border, but as a byproduct of that, has given a lot of new migrants work authorization in the United States and really expanded our labor market. On the kind of explicit front, we've seen the Biden administration trying to tackle the really big processing backlogs that emerged during the COVID-19 pandemic. They've been flexible in waiving interview requirements for people coming on temporary work visas. They've gotten rid of duplicative, processing steps for people inside the United States who are trying to stay and adjust to permanent status. We are slowly moving into the digital age and moving our applications online and, seeing more efficient processing. The Biden administration has made maximum use of authority that Congress has given it to expand the number of non-agricultural temporary workers. Agricultural temporary workers is actually one of the few labor migration categories that's uncapped in the United States, and we've seen expanding use of that pathway. And then on the high school side, we've seen the Biden administration try to just make it clearer to people who hold graduate degrees in science, technology, engineering, and math, what their options are, that there are clear options for them, to better clarify what the rules are, and to show that there are both temporary and permanent pathways for those workers to come and stay in the United States. On the less intentional side, the administration has greatly expanded how many people have work authorization in the United States who previously didn't have it, and also has, through the use of something called humanitarian parole, allowed many people to come into the United States with temporary work authorization. So on the side of the already resident population, the Biden administration has opened something called temporary protected status, which gives the temporary right to live and work in the United States. They've opened it up to 1.4 million newly eligible people. Not that many have received it because of processing backlogs, but we're kind of working towards that. And it also created new lawful pathways to the United States for humanitarian migrants and people who otherwise might have come to the border without authorization. So that includes giving humanitarian parole to over 70,000 Afghans, to well over, I think my number is very outdated, 150,000 Ukrainians through our Uniting for Ukraine program. The administration's granted parole to almost 270,000 Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans who have a US sponsor. And through a new process that's been established for people to make appointments at the border to come in an orderly way and then be granted parole, we've let in over 300,000 people so far. That's all on top of our regular visa pathways that are pre-existing, but as mentioned, very outdated. This influx of new workers really seems to be helping our economy. Our US-born labor force has really been stagnating, but we've seen a lot of immigrants joining the labor force, and that seems to be helping us in our efforts to bring down inflation without triggering a recession that many had predicted for this year. All the same, as much as immigrants are contributing to our economy, again, as I said, this is very much not in our national conversation and very much not on Congress's agenda. I think I'll leave it there for now, but I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. Maybe to follow on what you ended with, it's of course also interesting to consider to what extent governments or institutions are viewing immigration as sort of a stopgap solution to some of the issues that we're facing. And it's not a question of either or, but sort of how to best maximize the potential of immigration and under what circumstances. So again, surely something that we'll be able to pick up on later. I'd like to now hand over to Ms. Watson to share your views on sort of policy discussions happening in the US at the moment.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Julia said a lot of what I would say about the general context. We have a real problem in that Congress hasn't made any significant immigration progress in decades. And if we think about 1990, when both our employment-based numerical caps and our family-based numerical caps were put in place, our economy, our real economy has doubled, and we are still letting in the same number of people through these pathways. What that means is that we have a lot of people around the world who are interested in coming to the US, who would greatly benefit our economy and who have no possibility of coming. So if people around the world don't have a college degree or specialized skills and don't have a family member in the US, for most people, it's almost impossible to have a regular pathway here. So of course, there's concern that that may lead to more irregular migration, which has a lot of causes a lot of hardship for the migrants themselves relative to regular migration, but also causes a lot of political heartache here for those of us who want to see immigration expanded. You hear this rhetoric in the US a lot about people just should really wait in line, but for many people, there simply is no line. And so, you know, my number one priority would be Congress taking this issue on in a way that's productive, and that will inevitably require some compromise. There are fairly deeply held views on this. And in fact, right now, I think the political incentives are for people in Congress or other politicians to be riling up their bases with an extremist position rather than trying to come to the table and solve a set of problems, which is really unfortunate and does, I think, put us at a disadvantage in the global picture here. And I sometimes do think about trying to use this idea that we're losing our competitive edge as a way to motivate people. Americans in general tend to be a little bit on the competitive side. And so to the extent we can say, look, other countries in Europe, Canada are going to take advantage of the talent that's out there if we don't make it easy for people to come. And so that's a message I've been trying to promote. But I don't think that is where the conversation is generally. It is more focused on the border, on asylum seekers, on security issues, and it's hard to move people away from that. And again, I think part of that's because for some people, it's a political winner to talk about that rather than to talk about the many economic gains that we can have from migration. And the migration is not just what we formally call the employment-based migration, which is actually a relatively small part of our system, but it includes the family-based migration that is, you know, that the people who come through that pathway are a very important part of our labor market as well. I think we could do more to think about specific labor migration for areas where we need workers, and so those include, you know, some of the high-skilled tech sectors where just there's almost no case that one can make to limit the number of people for those programs, but also things like nursing, things like direct care workers. Like Europe, we have an aging population, declining fertility, and we have a Social Security trust fund that is going to run out in 2034, which is going to require immediate cuts in the Social Security system unless Congress makes a different plan about that, and or a fairly substantial increase in taxes. And the only way to get out of this benefit cut or tax increase rut is to have more migration, because immigrants do extend the life of the Social Security system. Also, as we have this aging population, we're going to see more need for those direct care workers and for you know, labor that can support our aging population. So I think all of those issues are front and center for me. Another one I would add in closing is we do have about 11 million people who are in the US without authorization. Many of them do work, of course, but having a work permit and enabling them to basically have the protections that US born workers have, I think is really critical, and would allow many of those to move up the labor market ladder and contribute even more than they are now to our economy. So I will pause there. Look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much. Some really interesting points as well, not so much in terms of the sort of how do we get people to European Union member states or to the United States, but also what are some of the benefits of expanding labor migration on a structural level, but then also on a social level. Last but not least, and I also see, Mr. Boeselager, that you have your hand raised, but I would hand over to Ms. Hornung for a final statement. I mean, we, of course, have often heard that the EU, there's no one single labor market. There's, in fact, 27. It remains very fragmented. And so even though this skills and mobility package was now presented as sort of EU-level responses to some of the challenges that we're seeing, a lot of the implementation will, of course, have to be done at the member state level. And so you represent employers, so we'd be very curious to hear a bit more about how you view the dynamics that have been mentioned, as well as the recent launch of the package. So please, the floor is yours.
Happy to, Helena. Thanks a lot. But also, like, because Damian, you had a question, like, I'm fine giving you, like, letting you pose your question first.
No, sorry. I just because I didn't see you, you know, like aus dem Augen, aus dem Sinn. So, like, I just forgot that you're still speaking. So I'm happy to ask my question later. But thanks.
All right. Yeah, indeed. German employers cross-sectoral represent around 1 million companies in Germany. And well, let's maybe start with how we stand as Germany. According to the OECD talent attractiveness, we are on place 15 out of 38 OECD countries. That's not very attractive. And securing skilled labor is one of our central challenges for the German economy, in not only in the next years, but also in the next decades. And of course, related to demographics, the structural shortages will get worse. So there are predictions for 2030 that the German labor market will be short of 5 million people. That's enormous, of course. So I guess, like, for some of you maybe, or when I'm here on EU level in discussions, that usually we are, as Germany, known for a more progressive labor migration policy, but we do also have a lot of challenges, persisting ones, and the major one is bureaucracy. And I know employers always say that, but this one really, like, this is about bureaucracy and administrative burdens, not only for employers, but also very much for third country nationals, for the workers. So those administrative procedures are extremely complex. They're time consuming and lengthy. They're costly, both when it comes to issuing work permits and visas, but also when it comes to the recognition of qualifications. But one thing, of course, we are always pushing for a more flexible and easier legal framework, but we can further develop the legal framework as much as we want, as long as we don't achieve real progress when it comes to the immigration administration, that this will have little impact. And so here the procedures really need to be simplified, digitalized. That's a major issue in Germany as well, and accelerated. And that pretty much, it takes three things. It takes political will, it takes comprehensive capacity building in the administrations, and a welcome culture. Because a welcome culture does start in the moment you enter the embassy for a visa appointment. And of course, it doesn't end there. So I think my main point is that successful labor migration really depends on a functioning local immigration administration. That's one of my main points. Helena, you asked me also to shed some light on the national developments, but I will do that just very quickly. We do have a new legal package in place, and it consists pretty much of three pillars. The first one is highly skilled, so more flexibility for employing highly skilled people, new blue card, of course, but also, for example, the qualification you need to bring doesn't have to suit the actual job you're doing. So you could have studied agriculture and then work in banking. The second pillar is experience, professional experience. So lowering the requirements for people who have professional experience to access the labor market. And the third pillar is the so-called potential pillar. It's for people who wouldn't be able to access the labor markets with the existing existing legal channels. So it's pretty much a job search visa and a points-based system, similar to the one in Canada. So that is the national situation. But again, we need the administrative local capacities to make those new laws, to actually make them a reality, and to do speed and meet all those targets and speed up procedures. And maybe lastly, of course, looking at the EU level, because there's so much work has been done, and I think we really succeeded, like as really literally as a multi-stakeholder alliance, succeeded in putting labor migration on top of the agenda with the revised Blue Card Directive, the single permit directive, long-term residence, and now, of course, the new talent package by the Commission. So for us, I think it's like the talent pool is a very important political signal. That talents from abroad are welcome here. I think with those, at least if I looked at looked at it yesterday and analyzed the package, we really have national contact points in between the employers and the employees who are supposed to have expertise in the area of employment and migration, who can actually guide and consult, and when it comes to the entire visa process, also post-selection and post-matching. And of course, another file I've been incredibly happy to read and analyze was the one on the recognition of qualifications. That has been tackled, of course, with limited competences, because it's up to the member states. But at least we do have a clear. Now I'm lacking the word. It's not guidelines. A clear recommendation. Sorry. By the Commission, which is committed to really make it easier for people to let their qualifications be recognized. So, and also stating clearly something we've said since years: when it comes to non-regulated professions, you don't need to have a formal recognitions, and employers don't need that. That shouldn't be mandatory. And at the same time, we need to ease the requirements for the regulated professions, because they are very rigid. And finally, what the Commission calls the skills first approach, so that we don't only look at the qualifications, but we also look at actually the skills the people have. And that doesn't, because I always then get in discussions with other actors, of course, that doesn't mean that qualifications become obsolete. It's just taking the rigidity out of it and creating more flexibility here. So I think with that new package, we're really on a good path, at least with the possibilities the EU has within the treaties. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I actually want to pick up on the very last point that you made, which is that, of course, in all of these discussions, there's a large focus on the need to improve competitiveness or to harness it so as not to lose out on the quote unquote global race for talent, which so far has seen greater interest in economic opportunities in places like the US, Canada, and the UK, as was mentioned beforehand. And it also means that a lot of attention is placed on high-skilled jobs. However, we also know that skills across different levels are needed. So I'd invite all the speakers to share your views on how we can sort of best square a focus on skills as opposed to qualifications, and what additional actions would be needed with regard to either aspect. And in addition to that, I'd be very happy to hand over to all of you for any initial reactions and comments to what the other speakers said. And maybe Mr. Boeselager, I can indeed start with you.
Yeah, sorry for being a bit impatient with my question earlier. No, I just like when listening to Julia and Tara, I was just wondering, because I mean, here we often have the discussion, and Teresa and I had that as well, of like, you know, wouldn't it be helpful if you de-link a bit the two questions of labor migration on the one side and asylum on the other, which have very different perspectives on them. And so do you think that there's any chance of somehow in Congress educating policymakers on the differentiation between the two, to maybe say like, look, actually, yeah, regular pathways, even though I don't like the term, but like could be increased and improved, even though. So anyways, this is my question, I think, to you. And then sorry, your question was on
skills and qualifications, because there's a large focus
okay.
on sort of high skilled workers, but then we also see that recognition of qualification can sometimes be a building block, and there's of course a need to also recruit workers across different skills levels.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if you look, and Jonathan has the numbers much better than I do in his mind, but like where you know, talent is needed, international talent is needed, is not in a highly qualified sector only. So the cool thing about the talent pool is that it is actually for all skill levels. So I think that's already helpful that we're going a bit in the direction of you know, talking about talent of all kind of skill and wage levels, if you want, qualification levels. So that, I think that's helpful. In the blue card, we already moved away a bit from the idea that if you're a tech, that you have a tech background and you have a great, what is called, GitHub profile, then you don't need to necessarily, you know, have this like on your CV a master in some form of an IT, you know, qualification. So I think that that's the right direction, and we should go more and more into this direction to really meet the needs that we have.
Thank you. Mr. Chaloff, would you like to share your views?
So a few interesting points that that came up in this discussion. One of the questions is about who's the loudest in this debate in different contexts. So we heard about the U.S. and the direction in which the legislative body is bringing the discussion. There's a need to find a balance between different stakeholders and what's convincing. I mean, at the OECD, we're an evidence-based organization. We try to support policy development, but in the end, migration policy is a political decision because it's a question about what you want to do with migration. No, so there is no best migration policy anywhere. It's really depending on what the objectives are that have been set by the country. So it's a question of how quiet are those stakeholders whose objectives are securing labor. That's, I guess, was the first one. The second one, which is something which also struck Damian, I guess, is that many of these measures in the U.S., parole and extending employment authorization, seem to be in the, let's say, in non-professional jobs. So they don't seem to be skill-based. I just wondered whether you could mention any examples where these are approaches that are designed to bring large numbers of skilled workers, because it seems like the real bottleneck in the system, there's no formal mechanism for low-skilled migration, really, at least in long-term, if you put aside the seasonal agricultural and rotational work. So is there a use? Is this a mechanism which is also used? The third point that I would say is that even an awful migration system that's really difficult to use and unpleasant, and is still not enough to make a attractive destination less attractive. So, I mean, the countries that are very attracted to migration are sometimes those which have the most difficult migration systems to use, because in the indicators of talent attractiveness, one of the main takeaways is really that it's the labor market, it's the conditions for integration that make a country attractive, and many migrants are willing to put up with a real hassle and very difficult, long, uncertain procedures in order to have a chance to go. What that means for countries that are perhaps less attractive on some of the structural factors is that there's only so much that a smooth migration system can guarantee. That's not to say it's not worth it, because I mean, a real welcome culture, a real red carpet does does help, but it's not enough necessary to reverse some structural factors making the country less attractive.
Thank you. Some of the questions were maybe directed to what you said in your initial contribution. So Ms. Watson, I'd be happy to hand over to you first, and then Ms. Gelatt, happy to also hear what you have to say.
Sure. The question about basically, why don't we de-link the conversation about specialized technical migration from these other conversations? I think, as I sort of alluded to before, there really isn't the political incentive to do that in the US. So there is a group of people who says, we can't possibly start to talk about migration of software developers until we secure the border. And there is another group that says we can't possibly talk about the migration of software developers until we address the fact that there are 11 million people who have been living in the US a long time without authorization and have an uncertain future. And to simplify a little bit, it's like each of these groups is holding high tech and high skilled migration sort of hostage in order to achieve their broader reform goals. And so we are stuck in this world where it is not in anyone's political incentive, even though if you were to ask almost anyone whether they would like to see high-tech migration expanded, most people would say yes. In terms of using the asylum system to support this sort of high-skill labor migration, that's not an explicit part of the system. Sometimes that happens because of who's seeking asylum, but for the most part, the economic migration that's happening is either happening through this fairly limited set of employment-based pathways, or is happening through family-based migration, which for the most part is people with less education, but who are very active in our labor market and important to our labor market. Julia, I don't know if you have additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think, you know, in terms of the politics, it's also that we see in public opinion polls in the United States that when there are high numbers of arrivals at the border, support for immigration overall decreases. So even if our politics weren't so polarized, it does become more difficult to talk about labor migration pathways in the context of really high border arrivals, even though we're in a chicken and egg problem, right? Because if we were to create more of those legal pathways, especially across the skill spectrum, we know that that could reduce the pressure on the border. There's evidence that, you know, increased use of our agricultural pathway led to decreased irregular migration from Mexico because people who wanted to come were able to use that pathway instead. So it's really just a matter of how do we get out of this kind of trap that we're in. And Jonathan, you pointed to the fact that we don't have pathways for, you know, lesser skilled migrants for year-round jobs. And as Tara mentioned, many of those people are coming through other parts of our immigration system, and I think increasingly are coming through our asylum system and coming to the border and getting humanitarian parole. I think the skill profile of people coming today might be quite different than what it was, you know, when many people coming to our border were from Mexico and maybe rural parts of Mexico at that, and coming from Central America. We're seeing a lot of people from Venezuela, some of them are professionals, from Cuba might be professionals. A lot of the Afghans who came, you know, worked with the US government, are English fluent, had master's degrees in various fields in Afghanistan. Ukrainians are coming with a mixed skill profile. So I think we actually might be bringing in quite a range of skills these days, even unintentionally, but whether we're doing a good job, just, you know, as Europe has challenges with recognizing foreign skills and credentials, we are really pretty bad at that in the United States too. The pandemic forced some adaptations in healthcare fields since we had such shortages. There are some states that are doing a better job at opening those jobs to migrants who have foreign training. But there's much more that we could do there. And then, you know, I don't know the English profile of all of the migrants who are coming today, which can also be a barrier for people who have professional skills, but may not have the English skills to really make use of them. So
I just have to say goodbye. I have to go to the next panel, but thanks a lot for having me and have a good discussion.
Thank you for joining us. Sorry, I hope, in case you still wanted to add something, then please feel free to continue. But before I turn over to you for any initial reactions and comments, I also just wanted to remind everyone online to please feel free to already post your questions. You may also specify in case you would like a specific person to respond to your questions, because I'll be opening up the floor after Ms. Hornung has taken the floor. And likewise to everyone here in person, please feel free to then just raise your hand in case you'd like to come in. But please, before that, over to you.
Thank you. I agree with Damian on the talent pool. I was glad to see that it's open to all skills levels. I think just member states need to have in place different legal channels for different skills levels, and they first and foremost need to have clear and accessible information about those different ways, because that's often where the problem already starts. At the same time, of course, in lower skilled groups, flexible learning offers, modular learning, partial qualifications. Also, like companies are really like willing to also to train people on the ground in the companies. So I think there we need to keep a lot of flexibility in mind. And the last point, which is maybe a bit softer but highly important, I think we need to also have a shift in thinking when, for example, the entities that do check the qualifications and are in charge of formally recognizing them, and the majority of those entities look at it from a point of, okay, where are the differences, instead of looking where are actually the similarities. So it's like, it's not always a very people-friendly way in practice of how this is conducted, how curricula are compared in learning outcomes.
Thank you. I'd like to now open the floor to anyone who would like to ask a question. As I mentioned, please feel free to raise your hand, and I'll also be monitoring the Q&A.
Yeah, many thanks, Helena, and to all of our panelists as well. My name is Anastasia. I work here at the European Policy Center, also in the migration program. So it was really interesting to hear all of your inputs today. I have two questions, one of which I was hoping to direct to Damian, but alas, so it goes. The second one that I had related to the benefits of migration, linked also to the way that demographic change and the consequences of demographic change are perhaps communicated to the population. So perhaps first for the US-based colleagues, I was wondering if you could perhaps weigh in a bit more on whether and to what extent and how the risks that might stem from an aging population, but likewise labor shortages, are communicated to the US population. If you see that this features as justification as to why we should be focusing more on improving and opening up legal and labor pathways. And relatedly, and then also happy to hear from our other panelists, is more broadly just about how we can better communicate about the benefits of labor migration and of legal migration, or actually of migration in general. Because quite often the focus tends to be on the risks that might be associated with it, which I think also, of course, is in response to public opinion. The two essentially are mutually reinforcing. So happy to hear also from all of you on what we can do to make sure that we actually highlight the benefits as opposed to the possible risks. Thanks.
Thank you. Checking to see if anyone else. Yes, please.
Hi, many thanks for, is the microphone picking up? Yeah, many thanks for all of your interventions, and my question sort of complements the one of my colleague Anastasia. I'm Marina, also from the European Policy Center. with regards to also factoring in the benefits of labor migration for the countries of origin, because of course, a lot of times we speak about how labor migration, of course, benefits the country of destination, but it also, of course, within and of itself benefits the countries of origin because of remittances, both economic remittances, but also intellectual, etc. But I was wondering if I could hear more from our speakers on whether they think there is a need for the EU and US policymakers to factor in the needs of partner countries more when designing labor migration policies. And perhaps the kind of partners that they choose to develop these labor partnerships with. Of course, a lot of times partner countries have concerns related to brain drain, but also labor migration can be seen as perhaps an opportunity to address certain root causes of countries of origin. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about this, and also perhaps on whether you think that there's a perception sometimes by politicians and policymakers that the interests of the countries of origin are considered perhaps in conflict with the ones, the countries of destination pursuing these labor policies. Thank you.
Many layers to both of those questions. Thanks very much. So we have one on communication and one looking at the benefits or also the incentives for countries of origin and partner countries in general. I'd be happy to maybe start off again with you, Mr. Chaloff, and then maybe also for the more sort of national perspective, and then to hand over again to you, Ms. Watson and Ms. Gelatt, and also happy to hear any insights on sort of the outreach efforts by the US government, in particular in the regional neighborhood, because of course in the EU context, there's a lot of focus on countries in the southern Mediterranean in particular for precisely those reasons. So happy to turn to you first, Mr. Chaloff, the floor is yours.
Thanks. So first, on this question of how do you communicate, I mean, there's a question of belief in experts and the credibility of experts, right? So just how much do people really care what experts say? And I think that's important when talking about demography, because a lot of the modeling and a lot of the information that comes up about sustainability of pension systems and growth in population is coming out of this kind of field of expertise, right? And it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily have political traction. So one thing that surprised me in the last 20 years, I have to say, is that this idea of demography as being one of the arguments for migration policy change actually began to be useful in a broad context in a number of countries. So I remember a conversation maybe more than 20 years ago with the American lobbyist Frank Sherry, who was very influential and very active. And we were just talking, and he said, you know, demography is not, it's not an argument. It'll never be, let's say, attractive as a political argument to say, oh, we need to bring migrants to keep up our population. But you can see in a few countries that this has become not just an argument of the bureaucracy and expertise, but actually has got some political traction. And in Germany, it's accepted. There's some consensus around this demographic scope of migration in Canada about the importance of population growth, and a few other countries, and certainly you see this in East Asian OECD countries now, is that the demographic question is probably one of the biggest policy concerns pushing reform. So in the past, I would have said, no, this is the sort of thing that nerds talk about with tables, and it's not going to be. At the same time, it's still a policy choice, right? So you saw with Brexit that even when the public was put in front of this idea that less migration was going to have an economic cost for them, many people preferred less migration. They said, I don't care if even it costs me 5% of my personal income, that's my price I'm willing to pay to have less migration. So you can't always base things on analyses of sustainability of pension systems and GDP growth, because there's a component in this policy discussion which goes beyond that. On the country of origin question, I think there's as I said, the US doesn't go with the bilateral route, no? And there are a number of the major destination countries which maintain this kind of agnosticism about country of origin. There are a few reasons for that. One is simply that the migration system should be driven by individuals and by employer choice. And so you can't, it's constraining employer choice to tell them they can only recruit from a few countries, and it's penalizing individuals to say that we're going to privilege some countries. But it's true that that is very much common in the European policy discussion about creating these favorable routes. And I think there may be two different reasons. We work a lot with origin countries in Asia through this annual roundtable that we do, and there, the interest in origin countries is just opening channels for as many people as possible. And there's a very strong interest in a number of origin countries in creating these channels. And so it is possible to get cooperation. Why would the state want cooperation? Well, they want reliable programs where you have compliance with the rules of the program. And so by having bilateral agreement, it's one way to deal with circularity in temporary programs. It's a way to ensure that the candidates that you get aren't coming with enormous debt loads, that they haven't paid recruiting agents, to ensure fair recruitment, which isn't just about human rights. It's also about having your migration program work properly. So there is, I think, on the one hand, a reason not to look at specific partner countries. And then there are certain kinds of programs, especially those which are very vulnerable, where it makes a lot of sense to try to have agreements in order for those programs to work properly. But again, it very much depends on the policy objective.
Thank you. And with that, I would be happy to hand over to you.
Yeah, Jonathan, I mean, like you said already, pretty much all the main points, I think. I agree. In Germany, for sure, like demography or like demographic concerns definitely made it into the mainstream and well accepted. And on the brain drain, I mean, talent partnerships, bilateral agreements with third countries, of course, they do come on top of existing legal pathways open to any third country national fulfilling the requirements. But like, of course, like irrelevant of the actual country of origin. For example, just to make it a bit more tangible, Germany has a few talent partnership with third countries. One is, for example, in the care sector, it's called a triple win. Quite a telling name already, because the country of origin, the worker, and the national economy slash the employer shall benefit from it. And there you have indeed deals, like Jonathan said, where you have a framework there where you can maintain or ensure compliance. You have ethical and fair recruitment practices, and you recruit in sectors where the countries of origins face a surplus of workers. So that is, of course, and that is something the European Commission will or is also trying to do on a larger scale with an alliance of different European countries, which is maybe interesting for some member states.
Thank you. And now over to the US perspectives. Ms. Gelatt, I'd be happy to give the floor to you first.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the conversation on demographics, I think, is really different in the United States. It does really still feel like this is a conversation that analysts have around small tables and that the public is not thinking about. It feels to me sort of like climate change. Maybe people are vaguely aware that this is off on the horizon, but the impacts really don't feel like they're here. And so it seems like an abstract thing that's difficult to think about. The Social Security cliff that we're facing is quite, that's very much in view, and nevertheless, there's, no political incentives to address that now. That's only a painful, that only involves painful adjustments. And so we'd rather just ignore that and just, put that off into the future. I don't know, I don't know at what point it becomes clear. We do see in certain states, for example, in Maine, in the Northeast of the United States, there's a particularly old population, and they're seeing, a population that's shrinking, and they have thought a lot about immigration and at times have embraced immigration, then gotten a little overwhelmed at who has shown up at their doors. But I think we're seeing that more at the local level, a recognition of the pains of an aging population and the role that immigration can play. But I don't know at what point those kind of local conversations will bubble up into our national politics, which Tara has described some of the constraints there. In communicating the benefits of labor migration, I think it's really difficult. we can say that on average, more immigrants, grow our GDP faster, and that immigrants don't just take jobs, they also create jobs by generating businesses and through their consumer demand. But what people really see is their daily experience. And if in their daily experience, they didn't get a job and they saw someone who was foreign born get that job, or, in an extreme case that gets a lot of coverage, there are Americans who have had to train their replacements who are coming on temporary visas. That gets so much more coverage than kind of the broad, hard to see positive economic impacts. And so I think it's sometimes difficult to communicate that, and people are inclined to believe the facts that support their worldview, anyway, motivated reasoning. And so it can be difficult for that, I think, to break through and really change minds. And yeah, I would agree with what Jonathan said, that we just don't really tend to think a lot about the sending countries and whether we're, draining off their best professionals. I mean, right now it feels like there are either countries that are in crisis, that are, have failed governments and are not providing for their people, where it's not reasonable to expect someone to stay, or migrants are coming from our immediate neighbors from Mexico and Northern Central America, which have been migrant sending countries for a long time and have really embraced, I think, the benefits of migration to them, the remittances that come back and the circular migration that brings new skills, and really see the benefits of migration. So that really hasn't been much of a part of our conversation. I think during the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about whether we needed more foreign trained health professionals to try to fill some of our nursing shortages in particular. And there were some news stories about countries that were, from which, nurses were being recruited by not just the United States, but Europe and other parts of the world. And that, maybe we globally needed to think a little bit about what we were doing to foreign health systems. But that was a rare exception to generally, I think, just thinking about our own interests, and unintentionally drawing many migrants, even though we don't have the policies to facilitate it.
Thank you. Ms. Watson, over to you.
I'll just add that I accidentally muted myself. I've been thinking that the labor shortages that we're facing right now, the very, active labor market, and in specific industries, the really clear need for more people, might help us to break through this logjam where I agree that somehow the message hasn't really gotten out, even though economists have been talking about the benefits of migration to the economy for decades. That isn't deeply ingrained in the broad public's mind. However, when people cannot find workers for their small business, when they we're trying to expand our semiconductor industry and we can't support that with the skills that we have in the US, or I've been thinking a lot about the aging population and the labor piece of that. When people cannot find someone to care for their elderly parent, I think there's going to start to be some pressure. And to the extent we've seen any sort of loosening of the polarization, I think it has come around people recognizing their immediate self-interest in trying to address some of these labor challenges. So I think that's a potential opening, but it does have to come down to people actually feeling it, and not just the reports that we all write to say this is a potential solution to a future problem. I think as the problem becomes more of a day-to-day problem for people, I'm hopeful that will start to loosen the logjam a little bit. I don't really have anything to add on the countries of origin, root causes work. I do know the Biden administration has been doing some work in Latin America to try to prevent people from coming to the border to address their migration needs, and trying to set up pilot offices in Latin America. But beyond that, it's been more of a laissez-faire approach.
Thank you. I would have a question myself, but I'd be happy to see if anyone in the audience has any questions for the panelists. Yeah, if you could move the microphone closer.
Thank you. Maybe a question for Teresa, just about the EU's talent pool. Is basically, do you think it's going to work? And how long do you think it will take to actually get off the ground? Is it something that your employers are excited about, or is it, looking through the proposals yesterday, it doesn't seem like it's obligatory for member states to actually participate in it. And also some of the framing around the announcement of the package was that it should help also irregular migration and be a route for people to come rather than through irregular routes, whether it's really going to be a game changer in that. Thank you.
Thank you. If you can maybe just quickly introduce yourself.
Sorry, I'm Becky. I work at the UK Mission.
Fantastic. So maybe in addition to that question, I would also have one, which is sort of thinking about sector versus market-driven systems. I'd be happy to hear if speakers could weigh in a little bit more on sort of the benefits of targeting specific sectors and at what governance level. I mean, the talent pool has a preference for EU-wide sectoral shortages with some possibility for member states to specify in case there are particular sectors where they are acutely facing shortages versus opting for a market-driven system that is perhaps less sectorally and geographically limited. I'd be happy to hand over to you first, Ms. Hornung, for the question from Becky.
Thank you. And thanks for the very good question, Becky. Because we've been, in the past 2 years, we've been part of so many consultation process also with the EU Commission on it. And we've been always behind the very idea of an EU talent pool, but the question of it's going to fly was those were like the nitty-gritty aspects of it, right? Is there interoperability with the national system, with EURES? Will our public employment services be able to merge it with their systems and so that we don't only have parallel structures? So it was actually the not so obvious, more technical questions that might be quite decisive at the end when it comes to applying it in the member states. But yeah, we are politically excited about it, and also I think with those national contact points, that is really important, because I don't know if at the end a small SME that posts the vacancies locally will then also start to register in a talent pool. But if, for example, right now as an employer, you hand in your vacancy to the employment services as well, there you can already now choose with just one click whether you want to have it published in EURES as well. And then you could just add another little box which is asking you whether you would also want to post it in or let it be posted in a talent pool. So those national contact points and the public employment services are crucial. And I think when it comes to that, it's very well thought through. And on the sectoral versus the open approach, the benefit of the sectoral is that also we said, let's maybe start small and do it well, instead of like just creating that gigantic pool and then it just leaves everyone, employers and workers, disappointed. So let's rather start small, do something good, and then leave the possibility open to broaden the scope, to extend it to also non-shortage occupations. And I think also, again, how the Commission did it now is quite smart with the updating the lists via delegated acts, but also that the member states can update their own lists pretty much.
Thank you. Mr. Chaloff, since you worked on the EU talent pool as well, already a couple of years back, would be curious to hear if you have any considerations regarding the implementation. We already heard that the timeline, it's not immediate. Negotiations still, of course, have to happen. So the earliest that we would see this materialize would be 2026, 2027. So yeah, any thoughts on some of the difficulties also in implementation would be very welcome. And then again, I'd be happy to hand over to the US-based speakers.
It's true that it takes a while to get started. It won't just be the introduction. And on the first day, there's no one in the talent pool. It's empty. So it takes time to fill up. So if you look at the examples that we cited in the feasibility study, these are kind of platforms that take years to get rolling. It's true that they can move in a lot, migrate a lot of the profiles from existing databases, but that's not enough. One of the main points in the feasibility study was that there's a lot that has to happen around this to make it work. There needs to be outreach. The candidates who go there should be some kind of validation that these are people who have the skills they claim to have, that someone's met them. I mean, this is the kind of program that you use in conjunction with things like job fairs and training programs. It wouldn't just sit there by itself to be really effective. So I think the approach that the Commission took is flexible. There's this voluntary opt-in approach. One of the limits is that these kinds of databases at the beginning are really the last resort rather than first resort for employers. And so the question is, how do you build trust around this and make this into, let's say, an attractive alternative to alternative recruitment systems that are in place, that are offered by the market? And how do you raise the credibility of public intervention in this area?
Thank you. I'd be happy to turn to either Ms. Watson or Ms. Gelatt.
We obviously don't have the same level of structured public attempts to match employers to potential workers. I think the H-1B system that we do have with its caps does have a lot of challenges. There's right now some efforts to streamline some of the problems with the system, but the one maybe parallel that I see here is that for smaller businesses, we have an H-1B lottery where the uncertainty can really inhibit businesses' ability to plan ahead. For large firms that use H-1B a lot, they can submit many applications and expect a certain percentage to come back. But if someone's just trying to hire one person, it's hard to rely on the H-1B lottery for that. And so again, coming back to in the US, I think the main issue has to do with the limits that we are imposing already on our flows.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, most of the pathways in the US are open to where employer demand is and open to many sectors. I know that Tara's been thinking about this. There's some conversation about whether having a focus on a particular sector could help us to break through the political logjam. If the most acute needs that are emerging are in old age support and in healthcare, would it be more useful to try to focus particularly on those sectors rather than on immigration broadly? And maybe there are some unlikely stakeholders that could come to the table on those. There was a bipartisan bill to recapture unused permanent immigration slots, specifically for healthcare workers, that had more Republican support than some other immigration measures. So I think folks are thinking about all different kinds of ways forward in the US to try to have any kind of changes to labor migration policies, and focusing on healthcare or on other kind of high need sectors could be one of them. There also was an effort, specifically focused on agriculture that also had broader support because of, who in Congress represents rural agricultural communities, that ultimately hasn't succeeded yet, but has moved further than some other proposals. So maybe that's a way forward for us.
Thank you. We have time for one final round of questions. If you do have a question, please raise your hand. Yes.
Hi, my name is Damian Teresa. I work for Konrad Adenauer Foundation. I must say I was a bit surprised by the positive outlook that you gave on the EU talent pool, because as far as I understood it, the EU talent pool does provide information and then some matching, but it does not really solve the underlying problem, right? So in the end, you still have to go through all the paperwork with the German authorities. And if that takes longer than 6 months, then it probably doesn't mean anything anymore for a company to hire, because then the hiring costs are too high to hire somebody. What does you bring? What in the proposal does convince you otherwise, that you think this is a good way to match people and to actually have an impact? Because I'm not yet convinced of the impact of this shiny new idea. This was, of course, a very bit more provocative question, but I hope you get the point. Thank you very much for organizing this, by the way.
Yeah, right away. No, I like provocative questions. That's good. It doesn't solve the national problem we face when it comes to our administrations. That's clear. But that is like, you can't expect the EU Commission to do that, because that's something we need to tackle on a national level. You can't outsource that responsibility, unfortunately. And the EU doesn't have competence to do so, of course. We were aware at the beginning of when we technically discussed and been consulted on talent pool, we thought through how can we make sure that it's not just like, imagine you register as a third country national to the pool, right? And then there's an automated matching, and actually like employer and third country national find each other. But then for some reason, maybe the requirements are not met for a national visa, and there's actually no work permit possible. That is highly frustrating for both sides. And that's been something we always we're cautious about. So it's not about glorifying the talent pool, but I think two things are very important about it. It is a strong political message, and we do as employers stand behind, and as an economy stand behind that political message we send out as Europe with opening the talent pool. Because look at the blue card, look at the green card, it can also become a bit of a brand. And the second point is, if a lot of people come via the talent pool who might not have had before had in their mind, oh, Germany is actually the place to go, but they said, no, I want to work in Europe. Let's see what they have to offer. And if there are really like a lot of member states participating, so if we really have traction, I think this can become an interesting system, and there's still a lot of potential. So I do, for now, without clarifying it, stay curious.
Thank you. Now we are almost nearing the end of the event, and I'd like to close with a final question. We, of course, talked about some of the obstacles at political level beforehand, as well as the need for political will. And there are, of course, also elections coming up. So if we put aside the question of politics, or we assume that there's a potential for either more bipartisan collaboration on the US side, or also enough trust and willingness of member states to actually collaborate and cooperate more on labor migration issues at EU level, what is one policy action that you would like to see happening in the short or long term? I'd maybe start again with you first, Mr. Chaloff, and then hand over to the other online speakers, and then close with you, Ms. Hornung.
I can speak personally based on some of the work that we've done about where there's an additional possibility within the current scope of competences. I think there's certainly space for a coordinated youth mobility scheme, which would address quite a few of the issues of attractiveness. And it's something that's been raised at the Commission level, and something that the OECD highlighted almost a decade ago. And so it would be a logical logical area of work. I mean, I think that you can see with the talent pool how difficult it is to transform an idea that people more or less agree on into something concrete, because of the separation of competences and this desire that the European action be effective. At the same time, this unwillingness to transfer any real decision-making process to Europe. So that's why I think that a youth mobility scheme could be an interesting point to explore.
Thank you. Ms. Gelatt?
If we can imagine that there's, space for immigration reform in the US, something that the Migration Policy Institute has been pushing for is a new employment-based visa pathway that we call the bridge visa. It would be a temporary to permanent visa that's open for employers to sponsor workers across the skills spectrum. So for the full range of jobs that last year round, creating pathways where they don't currently exist. The idea is that workers could come temporarily. If they wished to be circular migrants, they could come and stay for a bit and then go back home and then reuse the bridge visa again in the future with a new employer sponsor. Or if workers wish to stay permanently, they could self-sponsor for permanent residence in the United States. The idea would be to create a flexible scheme that has an expert body recommending changes over time. So we hopefully could divorce ourselves from the need to wait 30+ years for Congress to take action in adjusting caps and categories, and that it would be flexible to kind of meet the full range of labor market needs that are shifting over time. So if reform really were possible, that's what I would hope for.
Thank you. Ms. Watson, over to you.
In addition to, I think that would be great, but maybe a simpler reform would simply be raising the numerical limits for the current pathways that we have. And what I would do would be to try to, I think, immediately raise the employment-based caps dramatically, because they're just woefully inadequate and less politically controversial than the family-based caps. But for both cases, what I would do is build in incremental increases, something like 2% a year. That would be negotiable, but the idea would be, because our Congress has proved itself to be ineffectual at addressing this issue, we can kind of future-proof against further inaction by building in expansions in immigration. And then in a future Congress wanted to bring that in, of course, they would have the capability of doing that, but we shouldn't be relying on, we shouldn't be allowing the system to become this outdated. And so trying to future-proof, I think, will be really important.
Good word to keep in mind for this. Ms. Hornung, for a final word.
With regard to EU policy, which I find for this circle here much more interesting, from the category of desirable yet feasible, I would say to create a new European legal pathway, such like the blue card for startup founders via a European directive.
Thank you. With this, we're out of time. I'd like to thank all the speakers for sharing your views and your thoughts, and for also providing some recommendations towards the end. I'd also like to again thank our partners for the event, the U.S. Mission to the European Union. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. In the coming months, the EPC's migration team will continue exploring the future of labor migration to the EU. So I would encourage all of you to keep an eye out for further events and publications. Thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you here again soon.
Thank you.